You don't insult a man like Marco Vitali in his own language and expect to walk away unnoticed. Beatrice Whitfield knew that the second the words left her mouth. The bar had gone dead silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, and every man in that room was waiting for the ceiling to cave in. Instead, Marco Vitali set down his glass, looked at the exhausted, furious woman in wrinkled scrub bottoms, and started, impossibly, to laugh. The Level 9 lounge sat on the top floor of the Aurelian Hotel, a place where the elevator required a key card and the drinks cost more than Beatrice's weekly grocery bill. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in a room with hand-blown chandeliers and a wine list thicker than a surgical textbook. But her attending had comped her a card for the place 2 Christmases ago as a joke, half daring her to ever use it. And tonight, after 14 hours on her feet with her hands buried in a stranger's abdomen, Beatrice needed a room that didn't smell like antiseptic and fear. She was 27 years old, and she had been awake for 19 of the last 24 hours. Her scrubs, the deep navy blue that marked her as surgical staff at St. Agatha's, were still damp at the collar with dried sweat. She hadn't changed. She hadn't showered. She had walked straight out of a trauma bay, past the nurse's station, past the vending machines, and into a cab, because if she went home first, she knew she would sit down on her couch and never get back up. The surgery had gone sideways at hour 6. A 22-year-old motorcyclist, ruptured spleen, a liver that wouldn't stop bleeding no matter how many times she packed it. She had lost him twice on the table and gotten him back twice. And when he finally stabilized, she stood in the scrub room and stared at her own hands until they stopped shaking. Nobody had told her being good at this job would feel this much like drowning. She settled onto a leather stool at the far end of the bar, ordered a scotch neat, and did not make eye contact with anyone. The bartender, a thin young man with a waxed mustache, poured with theatrical precision and slid the glass toward her without comment. She was grateful for that. She had spent all day being needed. She wanted, for 20 minutes, to be furniture. The lounge was quiet at first, populated by a scattering of businessmen nursing cognac and a couple murmuring low over a shared plate of oysters. Beatrice drank slowly, feeling the heat of the scotch loosen something tight behind her sternum. She thought about the motorcyclist's mother, who had gripped her hand in the family waiting room and asked over and over if her son was going to wake up. Beatrice hadn't known how to answer that honestly, so she had said what she always said, "We're doing everything we can." It was true. It was also, some nights, the loneliest sentence in the English language. She was on her second scotch when the room changed. It wasn't loud. Nothing about it was loud. But the air pressure shifted, the way it does before a storm rolls in off the water, and every conversation in the lounge dropped by half a register. Beatrice looked up into the mirror behind the bar and watched 4 men walk in through the frosted glass doors. 3 of them fanned out immediately, taking up positions near the exits and the windows with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this 1,000 times before. They wore dark suits, no ties, jackets cut generously enough to hide whatever sat beneath them. The 4th man walked to the private booth at the back of the lounge, the one Beatrice had noticed earlier because it was the only table with a reserved sign standing on it in heavy brass lettering. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair combed back, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He moved like a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether a room would make space for him. He sat down alone, loosened the top button of his shirt, and lifted 2 fingers toward the bartender, who abandoned every other customer in the lounge to sprint toward him. Beatrice went back to her scotch. She didn't care who he was. She had spent her whole day surrounded by men who thought their presence rearranged the physics of a room. Surgeons mostly. And she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to survive that kind of ego was to simply refuse to feed it. She should have known that refusing to look was its own kind of provocation. One of the suited men, younger than the others, with a gold chain visible at his open collar, and a smirk that had clearly gotten him out of trouble more than it had gotten him into it, drifted toward the bar. His name, she would later learn, was Rocco, and he had the specific arrogance of a man who had never once in his career been told no by anyone who mattered. He leaned against the bar, 2 stools down from her, ordered a vodka soda, and looked her over with the slow, insulting thoroughness of a man appraising livestock. Beatrice felt her spine straighten. She kept her eyes on her glass. "Long day, sweetheart?" Rocco asked. His voice carried, deliberately the way certain men's voices always did when they wanted an audience. "You look like you slept in a dumpster." "I operated on someone's liver today," Beatrice said flatly, not looking at him. "What's your excuse for how you look?" A couple of the businessmen at the far end of the bar snorted into their drinks. Rocco's smirk flickered, just slightly, before he recovered it. "Feisty," he said, stepping closer. "I like that. You work down at the hospital? In that little uniform?" His eyes dropped, deliberately, insultingly down the length of her body, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Big girl like you. I bet you don't get a lot of attention. Must be nice, somebody finally noticing you." The words landed exactly where he wanted them to. Beatrice had heard some version of that sentence her entire adult life, from patients' families who didn't trust a fat woman with a scalpel, from dating apps full of men who fetishized or dismissed her in the same breath, from her own mother, once, in a moment Beatrice had never fully forgiven. She had built calluses over the place where those words used to hurt, but she was exhausted and raw, and she had just spent 6 hours with her hands inside another human being trying to keep him alive, and something in her simply refused to absorb one more insult tonight. She set her glass down with deliberate care. She turned on the stool to face him fully, and then, because her grandmother's voice was the only thing loud enough in her head to drown out her own exhaustion, because Nonna Concetta had spent 19 years drilling a stubborn, musical, half-forgotten dialect into her only granddaughter over Sunday gravy and second-hand grief, Beatrice answered him in Sicilian. It came out low, fast, and entirely without hesitation. She called him a loud little dog who barked because he had never learned to bite. She told him that a man who needed an audience to feel large was already the smallest thing in the room. She told him, in words her grandmother used to spit at the television during the evening news, that his mother should be ashamed of the mouth she raised. The dialect rolled off her tongue with a fluency she hadn't used in years. The vowels swallowed the way Nonna Concetta used to swallow them, sharp and rhythmic and entirely unmistakable to anyone who had grown up hearing it. It wasn't the polished, tourist brochure Italian people expected from a textbook. It was the real thing, worn smooth by generations of use, and it landed in that lounge like a dropped glass. Rocco's face went through 3 distinct stages. First, confusion, because he clearly hadn't understood a single word. Then alarm, because he could see, even without understanding it, exactly how badly he'd just been put in his place. Then, as he glanced desperately toward the back booth, something closer to genuine fear, because Marco Vitali had heard every word. The lounge fell into that particular silence that Beatrice would later come to know intimately, the silence that fell whenever Marco Vitali's attention shifted anywhere in a room. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the businessmen at the end of the bar, who had been laughing at Rocco's expense 30 seconds earlier, went rigid and suddenly very interested in their drinks. Beatrice didn't know, not yet, that the dialect she'd just used wasn't some generic Romance language Italian. It was a village dialect from a stretch of the Sicilian interior so small it barely existed on modern maps, a dialect that had traveled to this country in the mouths of maybe a few hundred families a century ago and had been dying out, quietly, ever since. She didn't know that Marco Vitali's own grandfather had come from 3 towns over from wherever her Nonna Concetta had been born. She didn't know that the last time he had heard those exact words, that exact rhythm, had been at his grandmother's kitchen table, 40 years and half a world away. She only knew that the largest man in the room had gone very still, and that he was looking directly at her. Marco rose from the booth. He did it unhurried, the way he did everything, and crossed the lounge with his hands loose at his sides. Rocco practically flattened himself against the bar to get out of the way. Beatrice's pulse spiked, but she refused to look away. She had already decided, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, that if this man wanted to make an example out of her for embarrassing his associate, she was too tired to run from it. Marco stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even larger than he'd looked from across the room, and there was a thin white scar bisecting one dark eyebrow that caught the low amber light. His eyes were a deep, unreadable brown, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger. "Say that again," Marco said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that didn't carry the way Rocco's had. "The last part, about the mother." Beatrice's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to apologize. She had learned that lesson too, a long time ago. The moment you started apologizing for defending yourself, men like this one learned exactly how far they could push. "Why?" she said. "So you can decide how to have me thrown out?" "So I can hear it again," Marco said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, something that on any other face she would have called a smile. "It's been a long time since anyone spoke to me like that. Longer since anyone did it in that dialect." Beatrice studied him, trying to read the trap she was certain must be waiting somewhere in his expression. She didn't find one. What she found instead was something closer to hunger, the specific, aching hunger of a man hearing his own childhood spoken aloud by a stranger in a hotel bar 3,000 miles from where he'd learned it. "My grandmother used to say it to my grandfather when he tracked mud through her kitchen," Marco said quietly. "Cane senza denti," a dog with no teeth. He looked, briefly, almost young. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" "My grandmother," Beatrice said. Her voice was still guarded, but the fight had gone out of it a fraction. "She raised me. She was from a town near Enna. I don't even think it has a real name on any map anymore." Marco's expression did something complicated then, something Beatrice couldn't fully name, and he turned his head to look at Rocco, who was still frozen against the bar like a man waiting for a firing squad. "Apologize," Marco said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I was just—" Rocco started. "Apologize," Marco repeated. "To the doctor. And then you're going to wait outside." Rocco's face flushed a deep, humiliated red. He mumbled something that might charitably have been called an apology and fled toward the frosted glass doors without waiting to be dismissed twice. The 3 men who had been posted around the room relaxed by a fraction, the way soldiers do when a commanding officer's temper passes without incident. Marco turned back to Beatrice. He gestured, with the same unhurried economy of movement, toward the empty stool beside her. "May I?" Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the motorcyclist on her table, about the mother clutching her hand in the waiting room, about every man who had ever looked at her body before he looked at her face. She thought about how tired she was of being careful. "It's a free country," she said. "As far as I know, you don't own this bar." Something flickered across Marco's face, quick and gone before she could name it. He sat. "As it happens," he said, "I do." Beatrice let out a short, surprised laugh despite herself, and Marco Vitale, head of one of the last old-blood families still operating in the city's shipping and construction trades, allowed himself something that looked almost like relief. They talked for almost 2 hours that night. Beatrice never fully understood, looking back, how the conversation had stretched that long, how a man whose name made grown associates flinch had sat beside her at a bar and asked her, patiently, methodically, about her work. She told him about the motorcyclist, about the liver that wouldn't stop bleeding, about the particular exhaustion of holding someone's life in your hands and not being entirely sure your hands were good enough. She hadn't meant to tell him any of that. It came out anyway, the way things do when someone finally asks a real question instead of a polite one. Marco listened the way she imagined he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, his dark eyes tracking her face like he was cataloging every word for later use. When she finally asked him what he did, he told her, simply, that he ran a shipping company that his father had built and his grandfather had started, and that most of what people assumed about men in his position was true, and some of it wasn't, and he wasn't going to insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. "You're not going to deny it," Beatrice said. "I've found," Marco said, turning his glass slowly on the bar top, "that people respect honesty more than they respect a good lie, even when the honesty is ugly." That's a very convenient philosophy for a man who probably has a lot of ugly things to be honest about. Marco's mouth curved. "You have a sharp tongue, Dr. Whitfield." "I never told you my name." "Your hospital badge is clipped to your scrub pocket," Marco said. "St. Agatha's. Trauma surgery, from the look of your hands." His gaze dropped, briefly, to her fingers wrapped around her glass, the short nails, the faint red marks where surgical gloves had bitten into her skin for 6 straight hours. "You should have someone look at that irritation on your knuckles. It's not healing right." Beatrice blinked at him, startled. "Are you always this observant, or is that a special service for people who insult your friends in a dead language?" "Rocco isn't my friend," Marco said, and something cold moved behind his eyes for just a moment before it cleared. "He's my cousin's husband. I keep him around because family is complicated, not because I respect him." He looked at her again, steady and unhurried. "You, on the other hand, I find myself wanting to keep around for entirely different reasons." Beatrice felt heat climb up the back of her neck, and she hated, briefly, how easily this stranger had gotten under her skin after 2 scotches and a bad day. "I'm not looking for anything," she said. "I have a 100-hour work week and a resident who can't tie a square knot to save his life. I don't have room in my schedule for whatever this is." "I'm not asking for room in your schedule," Marco said. "I'm asking if I can walk you to your cab." It was such a small, ordinary request, wrapped inside a man who was clearly anything but ordinary, that Beatrice found herself agreeing before she'd fully decided to. He walked her down through the private elevator, through the marble lobby, out into the cool night air where a valet had already pulled a black car to the curb without being asked. Marco didn't try to touch her. He didn't try to kiss her, didn't slide a business card into her palm the way she half expected. He simply opened the cab door for her, waited until she was settled inside and said, in that same, low, unhurried voice, "I would like to see you again, Dr. Whitfield. Not because of tonight, because of the way you talked about that boy on your table. I don't meet many people who care about strangers the way you do." "You don't even know me," Beatrice said. "No," Marco agreed, "but I intend to." The cab pulled away before she could think of anything clever to say back, and Beatrice spent the entire ride home staring out the window, replaying the sound of her grandmother's dialect in a dangerous man's mouth, and wondering exactly what she had just started. For 3 days, nothing happened, and Beatrice told herself she was relieved. She threw herself back into the hospital's brutal rhythm, rounding at 5, scrubbing in by 7, running from the ICU to the OR to the cafeteria and back again with a granola bar clenched in her teeth because it was the only meal she had time for. Her resident, A nervous, overeager third-year named Patrick kept asking her if she was feeling all right because she'd been unusually quiet, and Beatrice kept telling him she was fine, which was mostly true, except for the way she found herself listening for a low, unhurried voice every time the OR doors swung open. On the fourth day, a delivery arrived at the nurse's station addressed to her. It wasn't flowers. Beatrice half expected flowers, the cheap, obvious gesture men like Marco Vitali were supposed to make, and she'd already prepared her flat, unimpressed response. Instead, it was a heavy wooden box, the kind used to ship fine wine. Except, when Nurse Whitaker helped her pry it open at the breakroom table, it was full of thick, insulated compression sleeves, the medical-grade kind that cost more than Beatrice's monthly parking pass, exactly the kind she needed to keep her hands from swelling after long surgeries. There was a card tucked inside, handwritten in sharp, slanted script. It said only, "For the knuckles." No name. He hadn't needed to sign it. "Who sent you medical compression gear as a gift?" Nurse Whitaker asked, eyebrows raised nearly to her hairline. "That's either the most romantic thing I've ever seen or the strangest." "I have no idea," Beatrice lied, and spent the rest of her shift with her pulse doing something complicated and unprofessional every time she thought about it. He called her 2 days later. She didn't know how he'd gotten her number, and when she asked, he told her, without a shred of embarrassment, that he'd looked her up and that he wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. She should have found that unsettling. Instead, she found she believed him more for admitting it than she would have if he'd claimed some more innocent explanation. They started meeting for coffee at odd hours, whenever Beatrice's schedule allowed it, in quiet diners far from the Aurelian's chandeliers, places where nobody recognized either of them. Marco showed up alone every time, no suits fanning out around the exits, and Beatrice slowly came to understand that this was its own kind of gift, that a man who was never without his men had chosen to be, deliberately, ordinary for her. She learned things about him in fragments, that his father had died when Marco was 22, forcing him to take over the family's business a decade before he'd been ready for it. That he had a younger sister who had moved to Vancouver specifically to get away from the family name, and that Marco paid for her law school without ever once asking her to come home. That he still spoke the dialect with his grandmother, who was 91 and lived in a house on the edge of the city that Marco visited every single Sunday, no exceptions, ever, in 20 years. "That's why it hit me so hard," Marco admitted one night over lukewarm diner coffee, his big hands wrapped around a mug that looked comically small in his grip. "Hearing you speak it. Most people who work for me, who owe me favors, who fear me, none of them speak it. It's dying with my grandmother's generation. And then you, some stranger in scrubs at my own bar, come out with cane senza denti like you'd been saying it your whole life." "I basically had," Beatrice said. "My nonna raised me. My mom left when I was 6. My dad worked nights. Nonna Concetta was the one who actually showed up every day, and she never once spoke a full sentence of English to me if she could help it. I think she thought if I learned it well enough, some part of the old country would survive in me even if I never set foot there." "Did it work?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I've never been. But I dream in it sometimes. Does that count?" Marco looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face. "It counts," he said quietly. The trouble came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks into whatever it was they were building, in a way that neither of them had planned for, and both of them, in hindsight, should have expected. Marco had insisted on taking her to dinner at a restaurant he half-owned, a small, unglamorous Italian place 2 neighborhoods over from the Aurelian's glass and marble, the kind of restaurant where the owner still made the pasta by hand every morning. Beatrice had come straight from a 12-hour shift, this time actually changed into real clothes, a simple green dress that she'd bought 2 years ago and never quite worked up the nerve to wear, and Marco had looked at her when she walked in like the whole restaurant had gone quiet just for her, though in fact it hadn't. It had gone quiet for him, the way rooms always did. They were 3 courses into dinner, Marco telling her a long, self-deprecating story about the first time he'd tried to run one of his father's meetings and had been so nervous he'd knocked over an entire pitcher of water onto a union representative's lap when the door of the restaurant swung open hard enough to rattle the glass. 2 men walked in, neither of them regulars, both of them wearing the specific twitchy energy of people who had come somewhere they weren't welcome and knew it. Beatrice recognized the tension in the room before she understood its source. She had spent enough time in emergency departments to know the particular quality of silence that meant something was about to go wrong. "Vitale," the taller of the 2 men said, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "You've got some nerve, sitting in here like you own the block." Marco didn't stand immediately. He set down his fork with the same unhurried calm Beatrice had noticed the very first night, and when he finally rose, it was slow, deliberate, a man choosing his own pace rather than reacting to someone else's. "Costa," Marco said, his voice level. "This isn't the place. Whatever quarrel your family has with mine, it doesn't belong here, in front of civilians. Your father cheated my father out of the docks 15 years ago, the man snapped. "I don't much care where the conversation happens." Beatrice's pulse spiked, but she made herself stay seated, made herself breathe the way she'd trained herself to breathe in the chaos of a trauma bay, cataloging exits, cataloging threats, refusing to let panic take the wheel. She noticed, distantly, that 2 of Marco's men had appeared from somewhere near the kitchen and were positioning themselves calmly along the wall, not drawing weapons, not escalating, simply present. The shorter of the 2 intruders shoved a chair out of his way, and it clattered against the tile floor loud enough to make half the restaurant flinch. Marco's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You want to talk business," Marco said. "You call my office, and you make an appointment like a person with manners. You do not walk into a restaurant where families are eating dinner and start throwing furniture." "Manners," the taller man scoffed. He took a step forward, and one of Marco's men shifted his weight, a subtle readiness rather than an attack. "You want to lecture me about manners while you sit here with your—" His eyes flicked dismissively toward Beatrice, taking in her dress, her size, her presence at Marco's table, and his mouth curled into something ugly. "What is this, slumming it tonight, Vitale?" The words hit Beatrice like a slap, familiar in their cruelty, and for one humiliating second she felt every old wound reopen at once. But before she could even decide how to respond, Marco moved. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't raise his voice. He simply crossed the small distance between them in 2 long strides and put himself directly between Beatrice's chair and the man who'd spoken, close enough that the intruder had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "You will not speak about her," Marco said, each word measured and cold. "In my presence, ever again. Do you understand me?" The taller man's bravado flickered. He glanced past Marco's shoulder at Beatrice, then at the 2 calm, waiting men along the wall, and something in his calculus visibly shifted. He shoved his companion's shoulder, a signal to retreat that tried and failed to look like his own idea. "This isn't over," he muttered, backing toward the door. "It very much is," Marco said, "for tonight." The 2 men left the way they'd come, loud on the way in and considerably quieter on the way out, and the restaurant exhaled all at once, conversation slowly resuming in nervous, scattered bursts. Marco's shoulders didn't relax until the door had swung fully shut behind them. Then he turned back to Beatrice, and whatever cold authority had been in his face a moment ago dissolved into something much softer, much more worried. "Are you all right?" he asked, crouching slightly beside her chair, his hand hovering near hers without quite touching it, as if he were asking permission. "I'm fine," Beatrice said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Her hands weren't even shaking. "I've had drunk families threaten to sue me in a trauma bay while their kid was actively bleeding out. This wasn't even in the top 5 scariest things that's happened to me this month." Marco huffed out something that was almost a laugh, though his eyes were still dark with tension. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was the Costa family. Old grudge, older than either of us. I should have expected they'd try something like this eventually. I didn't think they'd do it here." "Is it going to happen again?" Beatrice asked, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out, even though her heart was still hammering underneath it. Marco was quiet for a moment, weighing, she suspected, how much honesty she could handle. "Possibly," he admitted. "I won't lie to you about that. My world doesn't stay quiet for long. But I promise you, Beatrice, nobody is going to lay a hand on you while I'm breathing. That's not a line. That's a fact." She believed him. That was the frightening part. She believed him, the way she believed the numbers on a monitor, the way she believed the read of a scan. Absolutely, and without room for argument. And she didn't know yet whether that was the safest thing that had ever happened to her, or the most dangerous. The rest of the meal passed in a strange, careful quiet, both of them aware of how close the evening had come to going sideways, both of them unwilling to let it ruin whatever fragile thing they were building. When Marco finally drove her home himself, no driver, just the two of them in his own car winding through late-night streets, he walked her all the way to her apartment door and stopped there, hands in his pockets, not pushing for more than she offered. "I know this isn't what you signed up for," he said quietly. "A stranger's grudge, a scene in a restaurant, men treating you like you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be. I would understand if tonight was the last time I saw you." Beatrice looked up at him, at the scar through his eyebrow, at the careful, exhausted worry in his face, so different from the cold command he'd shown the intruders 20 minutes earlier, and she made a decision she would spend the following weeks second-guessing and never quite regretting. "I've spent my whole life being told I take up too much space," she said. "In rooms, in relationships, on dating apps, in my own mother's house. Tonight, a man said something cruel about my body in front of a room full of strangers, and you didn't flinch. You didn't hesitate. You put yourself between me and him before I even finished being angry about it." She paused, steadying her voice. "I don't know what your world is, Marco. I don't know if I'm equipped for it. But I know I don't want to walk away from the first person who's ever made space for me instead of asking me to shrink." Marco reached out then, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from hands she'd watched go cold and lethal not an hour before. "Then don't," he said simply. He didn't kiss her that night. He seemed to understand, somehow, that she needed the choice to be entirely hers, made on her own timeline. And so he simply pressed a light kiss to her knuckles, the same knuckles he'd noticed swollen and raw on their very first night, and told her to lock her door behind her. Beatrice spent the following 2 weeks learning what it meant to be, however carefully, however privately, part of Marco Vitale's life. She met his grandmother, a tiny, fierce, sharp-eyed woman named Nonna Rosaria, who had cried, actually cried, the first time Beatrice greeted her in the dialect, and who had spent the next 3 hours feeding her so much food that Beatrice had to unbutton the top of her scrub pants on the drive home, laughing the entire time at Marco's mortified apologies. She met 2 of his cousins, a handful of his employees, a world that was, beneath its dangerous edges, stubbornly, achingly ordinary. Sunday dinners, arguments about sauce recipes, a grandmother who nagged Marco about getting married before she died, even though she'd apparently been saying the exact same thing for 15 years. She did not, in those 2 weeks, meet the Costa family again, but she felt their presence in small ways, in the extra car that idled outside St. Agatha's parking garage some nights, in the way Marco's men had started nodding to her by name at the hospital entrance, in the careful, unspoken understanding that her life had gotten more complicated the moment she'd opened her mouth in that lounge and let her grandmother's language spill out into the wrong ears. The confrontation that would define everything happened, fittingly, at the Aurelian Hotel, exactly 1 month after the first night Beatrice had ever set foot inside it. Marco had invited her to a charity gala the hotel was hosting, one of those glittering, overproduced events where half the city's old money mingled with half the city's new money and pretended not to notice the difference. Beatrice had resisted for days, certain she would feel exactly as out of place as she had the first night at the bar. But Marco had been patient and insistent in equal measure, and eventually she had let his grandmother talk her into a dress, a deep burgundy gown that Nonna Rosaria swore on her own mother's grave made Beatrice look like a queen, and which Beatrice, standing in front of the mirror in Marco's apartment an hour before the gala, had to admit she didn't entirely hate. The ballroom on the Aurelian's second floor was a study in excess. Chandeliers dripping crystal, a string quartet in the corner, waiters circulating with trays of champagne that cost more per glass than most people's rent. Beatrice walked in on Marco's arm and felt every old insecurity rear up at once, certain that every eye in the room was cataloging her, weighing her, finding her wanting the way rooms like this had always made her feel. Marco seemed to sense it. He kept his hand steady at the small of her back, introduced her without hesitation to everyone they passed, not as his date, not as some vague +1, but specifically, deliberately, as Dr. Beatrice Whitfield, trauma surgeon, the woman who had saved more lives in this city than half the people in this ballroom combined. It was, Beatrice would later realize, its own kind of armor, the way he said her title like it mattered more than anything else in the room, because to him, it did. The trouble started with a woman named Priscilla Ashford Hale, a socialite whose family had donated the wing of the hospital where Beatrice sometimes operated, a fact Priscilla clearly considered relevant to every conversation she'd ever had in her life. She approached Marco with the practiced warmth of someone who wanted something, air-kissed him on both cheeks, and then turned her attention to Beatrice with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And who is this?" Priscilla asked, though Beatrice suspected she already knew exactly who this was, because everyone in that ballroom seemed to know everyone else's business within minutes of their arrival. "Dr. Beatrice Whitfield," Marco said, before Beatrice could answer for herself. "Trauma surgery, St. Agatha's." "How wonderful," Priscilla said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. Her eyes traveled, slow and obvious, down the length of Beatrice's dress, lingering exactly where Beatrice had spent her whole life being looked at with judgment. "You know, my family's foundation actually funds a wellness initiative at St. Agatha's. Nutrition counseling, that sort of thing. I'm sure it's very hard, being a surgeon and all, finding time to take care of yourself. Such demanding hours." The insult was so smoothly, expensively wrapped that half the people listening probably missed it entirely, but Beatrice heard every word of it, clear as a scalpel. She had spent 27 years learning to absorb comments exactly like this one, wrapped in concern, dressed up as kindness, designed to make her feel small in a room full of people pretending politeness. She felt her face heat, felt the old, familiar urge to apologize for her own body rise up in her throat. She did not get the chance to answer. Marco set down his champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray with a small, precise click, and the sound seemed to cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the ballroom, drawing the attention of the small cluster of guests standing nearby. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But something in his posture changed, something in the set of his shoulders, and the temperature of the conversation dropped several degrees all at once. "Priscilla," Marco said, his tone pleasant enough on the surface, edged with something underneath that made the socialite's smile falter. "Dr. Whitfield spent 14 hours last week with her hands inside a 22-year-old man's abdomen, keeping him alive after he lost his liver to a motorcycle accident. She lost him on the table twice and brought him back twice. She has not, to my knowledge, had a single uninterrupted meal in 3 weeks." He paused, letting that settle. "I would be very curious to know the last time your foundation's wellness initiative saved anyone's life." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the small crowd that had gathered, quickly stifled. Priscilla's cheeks flushed a deep, ugly red beneath her expensive makeup. "I only meant," she started. "I know exactly what you meant," Marco said, still calm, still perfectly pleasant, which somehow made it worse. "You meant to make her feel small in front of a room full of people whose approval you think matters. It doesn't. Not here. Not anywhere she stands beside me." He turned, deliberately, to face Beatrice fully, and the entire cluster of onlookers seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what a man like Marco Vitale did next. What he did was reach for her hand. He lifted it, slow and unhurried, the same knuckles that had first caught his attention weeks ago in a bar he happened to own, and he pressed his lips to them, right there in the middle of the Aurelian's glittering ballroom, in front of Priscilla Ashford Hale and her foundation and half the old money in the city. "This woman," Marco said, loud enough now for the whole cluster to hear, though his eyes never left Beatrice's face, "put a stranger's cousin in his own place with 4 sentences of Sicilian dialect that I hadn't heard spoken correctly since my grandmother was young. She held a boy's liver together with her bare hands so his mother wouldn't have to bury him. She has never once, in the entire time I've known her, asked this city for permission to take up space in it." He finally turned back toward Priscilla, whose expression had cycled through humiliation and was now settling into something like fear. "I would suggest, in the future, that you think very carefully before you decide who deserves your condescension." The ballroom, or at least the small radius of it that had witnessed the exchange, went completely, utterly silent. Beatrice felt every eye in the vicinity land on her at once, and for one terrible, familiar second, she braced for the old shame to swallow her whole. Instead, someone started clapping. It was one of the older waiters first, a man who had clearly been listening from a respectful distance and could no longer contain himself. And then, astonishingly, a handful of guests joined in, scattered, uncertain applause that grew steadier as it spread. Priscilla Ashford Hale turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the bar, her back rigid with humiliation, and did not reappear for the rest of the evening. Beatrice stood in the middle of it all, her hand still resting in Marco's, her face burning, though this time not with shame. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once the small crowd had drifted back into their own conversations and the string quartet had resumed playing. "Yes," Marco said, "I did." He guided her gently toward the edge of the ballroom, away from curious eyes, until they were standing near the tall windows overlooking the city's glittering skyline. "I told you, Beatrice, the first night we met. I don't get off on watching people be cruel to someone who can't fight back on equal footing in that kind of room. I've spent my whole life in rooms exactly like this one, watching people like Priscilla decide who's worth their courtesy based on a suit, a dress size, a bank account. I'm not interested in pretending that's acceptable just because it's polite." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, the chandelier light catching the scar through his eyebrow, and something loosened in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe around it. "My grandmother used to say something," she said slowly, "about men who protect what's theirs without needing anyone to see it. I never really understood what she meant until about 4 minutes ago." Marco's mouth curved into something soft, something entirely different from the cold authority he'd shown Priscilla and the Costa men both. "What was it?" he asked. "The saying." Beatrice recited it, the dialect coming easier now, less like a weapon and more like a gift she was choosing to give him. Roughly translated, it meant something like, "A man who guards his house does not need to shout about the walls." Marco's breath caught, visibly, audibly, and for a moment the noise of the gala seemed to fall away entirely. "Say it again," he murmured, echoing almost exactly the very first thing he'd ever said to her. She did, and this time, when he leaned down and kissed her, slow and certain, right there by the windows with the whole glittering city spread out beneath them, nobody in that ballroom was surprised at all. The Costa family made one more attempt 3 weeks later, and it was, in its own way, the least dramatic and most decisive confrontation of the entire ordeal. Beatrice was leaving St. Agatha's after a night shift, exhausted in the particular, hollowed-out way that came after a 12-hour stretch that included 2 traumas and a code that hadn't gone the way anyone wanted, when she noticed the same unfamiliar car idling near the parking garage exit that had shown up twice before. This time, instead of simply idling, it pulled alongside her, and the taller Costa man from the restaurant rolled down his window. "Dr. Whitfield," he said, and the use of her actual title, her actual name, sent a cold spike of fear through her chest that no amount of trauma training had ever fully prepared her for. "We should talk about Vitale, about what happens to people who get too close to men like him." Beatrice's hand had already found her phone in her scrub pocket, thumb hovering over the single contact Marco had insisted she save under a name that wouldn't draw attention if anyone ever went through her phone. She didn't get the chance to dial it. 2 of Marco's men, the same 2 who had been quietly stationed near the parking garage every night for weeks without her fully registering their presence as protection rather than coincidence, materialized from the shadow of a support column with the unhurried, absolute calm of men who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "You're on hospital property," one of them said, his voice flat and utterly without menace, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd shouted. "There are cameras on every inch of this garage, and half the security staff inside know your face from 3 separate incident reports already filed against you. You want to have this conversation, you have it somewhere else." The Costa man's jaw tightened. For a moment, Beatrice thought he might push it further, might reach for the car door, might escalate the way the man in the restaurant had almost done weeks before. Instead, he seemed to do the math on the 2 calm, patient men blocking his path, on the cameras, on the fact that Marco Vitale's world had apparently decided that a hospital garage in the middle of a night shift was not a battlefield worth fighting on. "This isn't finished," he muttered, the same words his cousin had used weeks earlier in the restaurant, and rolled the window back up before Beatrice could respond. The car pulled away, tires chirping faintly against the concrete, and the parking garage went quiet again except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Beatrice's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline she'd held at bay finally catching up to her, and one of the 2 men, the older one with graying temples and a face that looked like it had absorbed more than its share of hard nights, stepped closer, with careful, deliberate slowness. "You're all right, Doctor," he said, not quite a question. "Mr. Vitale's on his way. He'll want to see you're steady before he does anything else." "Does anything else?" Beatrice repeated, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. The 2 men exchanged a look, and something in it told Beatrice that whatever came next was going to be handled entirely without her input, in a part of Marco's world she wasn't meant to see the inner workings of, and for the first time since that night at the bar, she felt a genuine, unfamiliar fear, not for herself, but for what her presence in Marco's life might be costing other people, in ways she would never fully know. Marco arrived within 15 minutes, moving through the garage with the same unhurried, coiled energy she'd first seen the night he crossed the lounge toward her. Except this time there was nothing measured about the tightness in his jaw. He crossed the distance between them in long strides and took her face in both hands, checking her over with the same clinical thoroughness she used on her own patients, searching for injury before he allowed himself to relax even a fraction. "I'm fine," Beatrice said before he could ask. "He didn't touch me. He just talked." "Talked?" Marco repeated, and something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "Marco." She caught his wrist before whatever he was already calculating could fully form. "Look at me. I'm fine. Nobody laid a hand on me. Your men were here before I even finished being scared." She held his gaze, steady, the way she held a scalpel steady even when her own hands wanted to shake. "I don't want you doing something tonight that you can't undo just because you're angry. I've spent my whole career trying to keep people alive. I don't want to be the reason somebody doesn't come home." Marco was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving in a slow, absent arc against her cheekbone, and Beatrice watched something visibly settle in him, some decision made and set aside for calmer daylight. "All right," he said finally. "Not tonight. But this ends, Beatrice. Soon. Properly. Not with anyone getting hurt if I can help it, but it ends." What ended it, 3 days later, wasn't violence at all, though it came dangerously close to it, and it happened, appropriately enough, back at the Aurelian, in the same lounge where the whole strange story had started. Marco had arranged a sit-down, the old, formal kind, a meeting between the heads of both families in neutral territory, with witnesses enough to keep anyone from doing anything foolish. Beatrice hadn't been meant to attend at all. Marco had been firm about that, had told her, gently but immovably, that this was old-world business, and she would only be a complication in a room built for careful diplomacy. She went anyway. She told herself, riding up in the private elevator in her scrubs, still smelling faintly of the OR she'd left an hour earlier, that she wasn't there to fight anyone's battles for them. She was there because she was done being talked about in rooms she wasn't allowed inside, done letting other people decide, on her behalf, how much danger she was permitted to face for a relationship she had chosen with both eyes open. The lounge had been cleared for the meeting, the usual scattering of businessmen and socialites, replaced by a tense arrangement of 2 long tables facing each other, Marco's people on one side, the Costa families on the other, presided over by an older man Beatrice recognized instantly, from the photographs Marco had shown her once, as the current Costa patriarch, a lean, silver-haired man with cold, calculating eyes. Every head in the room turned when the elevator doors opened and Beatrice stepped out, still in her navy scrubs, her hospital badge clipped crookedly to her pocket. Marco's expression from across the room shifted from surprise to alarm to something that looked almost like helpless, exasperated affection, all in the space of a single second. "Beatrice," he said, low, urgent, crossing toward her. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," she said. "I came anyway." The Costa patriarch rose from his seat, unhurried, studying her with the same cold appraisal his younger relatives had shown weeks earlier, though his was sharper, more calculating, the look of a man who had survived decades in a business built on reading exactly how dangerous a person might turn out to be. "So this is the doctor," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "The one my nephews can't seem to stop talking about." "Beatrice Whitfield," Beatrice said, walking forward before Marco could stop her, extending her hand with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. "Trauma surgeon. I'm the reason, apparently, that your family has decided threatening someone in a hospital parking garage is a reasonable business strategy." A ripple of tension moved through both tables. The Costa patriarch's eyes narrowed, though something that might have been reluctant respect flickered somewhere beneath the calculation. "You have some nerve, doctor," he said, walking into a room like this uninvited. "I've walked into worse rooms," Beatrice said. "Trauma bays where the family of the patient wants to blame someone, anyone, for the fact that their loved one is dying, And sometimes that someone is me, standing there covered in their son's blood, trying to explain that I did everything humanly possible and it still wasn't enough. I've had grown men scream in my face over things I couldn't control. This room doesn't scare me nearly as much as your nephew seems to think it should." The patriarch studied her for a long, silent moment. Beatrice held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away, and somewhere behind her, she could feel Marco holding perfectly still, letting this play out, trusting her, she realized with a sudden rush of warmth, to handle herself. "Your grievance," Beatrice continued, before the silence could stretch too long, "is with Marco's father, from what I understand. 15 years old. I don't know the details, and honestly, it's none of my business. But I do know that threatening a surgeon in a hospital garage, on hospital property, with hospital security cameras running the entire time, is possibly the single least intelligent way I can imagine to settle a 15-year-old grudge. If this ever happens again, I will personally hand every frame of that footage to whichever detective in this city hates your family enough to actually use it. I imagine there are a few." For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the lounge moved. Beatrice was aware, distantly, of her own heartbeat, of Marco's careful stillness behind her, of the costumen on either side of their patriarch shifting uncertainly, waiting to see how their boss would respond to being addressed so plainly by a woman none of them had expected to say a word. Then the old man laughed. It was a genuine laugh, rough and surprised, and it broke something in the room's tension so completely that Beatrice actually felt her shoulders drop half an inch. "Cristo," he said, shaking his head. "Vitale, where did you find this one?" "She found me," Marco said, finally moving to stand beside Beatrice, his hand settling at the small of her back, steady and warm. "In this very bar, as a matter of fact. Told off my idiot cousin-in-law in dialect I hadn't heard properly spoken since I was a boy." The patriarch's sharp eyes moved between them, something calculating and, Beatrice thought, almost approving in his expression. "A woman who isn't afraid," he said slowly, "is worth more in this business than 10 men who are only pretending not to be. My own mother used to say that." He extended a hand, not toward Marco, but toward Beatrice. "Salvatore Costa. My apologies, Dr. Whitfield, for my nephew's poor manners. I did not authorize what happened at your hospital, and they will be corrected." Beatrice shook his hand, steady, unflinching, and felt the entire room exhale around her. The formal negotiations that followed took another hour, details Beatrice was mercifully not required to understand. Old grievances traded for new agreements. Territory and respect exchanged across a table in careful, measured language that belonged entirely to a world she was only beginning to understand the edges of. But the danger, the real danger, the kind that had put unfamiliar cars outside her parking garage and cruel words in strangers' mouths, dissolved somewhere in that laugh. In the moment, an old, dangerous man had looked at a fat, exhausted surgeon in wrinkled scrubs and decided, against every instinct his profession had trained into him, that she deserved his respect rather than his threats. Afterward, once the Costa family had filed out and the lounge had emptied back into its usual quiet elegance, Marco pulled Beatrice into the same private booth where he'd been sitting the very first night and simply held her for a long moment, his face buried in her hair, his breathing slow and unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him before. "You terrified me," he murmured against her temple. "Walking in here like that. Do you understand what could have happened?" "I understand," Beatrice said, "that I've spent my entire life letting other people decide how much space I'm allowed to take up in a room. I wasn't going to let that happen with this, too. Not with you. Not with something that actually matters." Marco pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still, weeks later, caught her off guard every single time. "My grandmother is going to want to hear every detail of tonight," he said. "She's going to say you have more spine than my whole family combined." "She's not wrong," Beatrice said, and laughed, a real laugh, loose and unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have in years. In the weeks between the sit-down at the Aurelian and the quiet, ordinary life that eventually followed it, Beatrice found herself returning, again and again, to a single strange realization, that the thing which had nearly destroyed her, the reflex to speak her grandmother's dialect out loud in a room full of strangers, had turned out to be the truest thing about her that anyone outside her own small family had ever bothered to notice. Patrick, her resident, still teased her about it during long call nights, asking her to teach him a phrase or two so he could threaten the vending machine when it ate his dollar, and Beatrice always obliged, laughing, feeling something in her chest loosen a little more each time she let the old words out into daylight instead of guarding them like a secret. Nurse Whitaker started leaving small gifts of her own after that, chocolate from a corner shop that reminded her of her own Sicilian mother-in-law, and Beatrice began to understand that the language she had spent her whole life speaking only in private, only to Nonna Concetta, only in kitchens that smelled like garlic and simmering tomatoes, had never actually been something to hide. It had simply been waiting for a room brave enough to hear it. 6 months later, on a warm evening in early autumn, Beatrice Whitfield stood in Nonna Rosaria's cramped, fragrant kitchen, stirring a pot of gravy exactly the way the old woman had taught her, while Marco argued good-naturedly with his cousins in the next room about whose fault it was that the Sunday game had gone into overtime. St. Agatha's had promoted her to head of trauma surgery that spring, a fact Marco brought up at every single family dinner, with the shameless, beaming pride of a man who had never once, since that first night at the bar, stopped believing she deserved every inch of the space she took up in this world. The Costa family sent a card that Christmas. Beatrice kept it, tucked inside the same drawer where she kept her grandmother's handwritten recipes, a strange, small monument to the night an insult in a dying dialect had rearranged the entire shape of her life. She still thought, sometimes, on hard nights after long surgeries, about the version of herself who had walked alone into that glittering, unfamiliar bar, exhausted and furious and certain she didn't belong there. She thought about how close she had come to simply staying quiet, to swallowing Rocco's cruelty the way she'd swallowed 1,000 cruelties before it. And she wondered what her life might have looked like if her grandmother's voice hadn't been louder that night than her own exhaustion. She was glad every single time that it had been. If you loved watching a shy, exhausted surgeon put an entire mafia dynasty in its place with 4 sentences of her grandmother's dialect, you know what to do. Smash that like button. Drop a comment telling us whether you'd have walked into that lounge the same way Beatrice did. And subscribe so you never miss the next slow burn mafia romance. See you in the next story.